So I titled my talk Lessons from the Field, and why I titled it that is that I kind of work at the intersection of robotics and computer vision. But I think a lot about how, particularly nowadays, many of the techniques that we have in deep learning can be applied to robotic data. And when we think about robotic data, it's somewhat different than the data that you would have in sort of a more traditional computer vision context. And particularly for this talk, I'm going to focus on sort of the underwater aspects of the work that we do, but the same kind of concepts and techniques I also apply in self-driving cars. But again, here we're just going to focus on the underwater bits. So I've been really lucky to be able to work on a bunch of different cool robotic platforms. So these are two Ivor 2s that we have at my lab at U of M. And with those, with platforms like this, I've been able to do lots of underwater archaeology work. And so this is some work we did in Pavlo-Petri in southern Greece, mapping a submerged city that sank around the Bronze Age. But again, sort of most of my career has been dedicated to building large-scale 3D reconstructions from optical cameras. And so this is a 200,000 pair 3D reconstruction. And so, you know, those the extent of this is sort of a couple hundred meters. But from that, you can get, you know, really fine resolution. So that's 0.5 meter on the scale bar down there. And you can see all the stones and rocks and other things on the archaeological site. So that was a site down in southern Greece. We've deployed cameras on big ROVs, and from that done other archaeological work. So this is a bunch of amphoras in a wooden shipwreck at the bottom of about 750, 800 meters. And so, you know, again, with optical reconstruction, you get both an image, but then also because we're doing stereo, you get these sort of richer 3D reconstructions. And so these are amphoras, and you can see that, again, you get this really fine scale resolution, which I think is, again, what we try to focus on is doing something unique and different. With other Ivors, we also use human push rigs. So this is a diver rig pushed by a colleague of mine, Ari. And, you know, it has a lot of the same technology. So we have LED, flashes, cameras, stereo cameras, and then GPS for when we're on the surface. But again, using those to build up 3D reconstructions, we deployed cameras on the Sentry vehicle out of Hui. So that's the camera system down there. And, you know, again, deep water camera systems, same kind of idea, optical cameras facing down with LED strobes. And we're able to big 3D reconstruction. So this is hydrothermal or bacterial mat work, looking at bacterial mats, again, kind of beyond 1,000 meters with one of those ROVs. But again, one of the cool things is you get not just the optical information, but also the 3D information. And one of the things you're gonna notice here are those kind of dark and light stripes, and actually show that here because this is kind of prior to us getting good at thinking about how do we address the issues of what happens to light in the water column and what changes that has on being able to do a 3D reconstruction that's accurate. This is just another one. And again, you know, one of the big focuses has been thinking over large scales. And so over a couple hundred meters, you know, how can we build up these 3D reconstructions that allow marine scientists, marine archaeologists, or whoever to be able to look at that data and say, okay, well, what useful can we do with this with the 3D context, with the spatial layout, with all that kind of information. And I like these because it's an opportunity to really get kind of camera images from these really remote environments that obviously at 800 meters are well beyond where divers would be capable of going. And so, you know, some of this work is leading towards things, you know, projects we have with NASA to think about, you know, exploration of other planets. And again, think about the same techniques about building maps, understanding those maps, and sending a robot around to gather data. Okay, so that's sort of what we do on the field side, and how does that intersect with sort of the research or what we're trying to do from the perspective of doing something novel. So hopefully everybody's heard about deep learning, but, you know, it's this thing that's sort of taken over the machine learning community, and is certainly the dominant form of the way that we pursue computer vision now, and lots of perception problems. Many other problems as well, but mostly perception problems is what I think about and look at. So quick lesson on deep learning as it relates to perception. If you haven't come across it before, people got really excited because a lot of this used to be really hard to do. You know, you take an image and you want to say, hey, what's in this image? And now deep learning is really, really good at saying, hey, there's a bird and a frog in this image, or a person or a hammer or a flower pot, et cetera. How does that work? Again, in 10 seconds. We typically take a lot of training data. So let's say images of things we've labeled cars, buses, trucks, motorcycles in a terrestrial context. We pass that data into a network, and then we refine the weights of that network by attempting to minimize the difference between the labels that it predicts and the ground truth labels. And then at test time, you can take a fresh image that you've never seen before, you pass it to that same network with those trained weights, and you get out a label, let's say truck. Okay, so that seems great, super useful, okay, awesome. And you're telling me it works well, that's great. It's gotten a lot of traction in the self-driving car community, right? So people want to do this problem where we solve, what am I looking at here? Okay, there's a person there and a car and a motorcycle helmet, et cetera. Okay, you can extend this and get to even pixel level segmentation. So what you see here is some images from a data set that we use in academia, quite a lot, called Kitty. There's some ground truth labels in the row below that, and then what the network predicts in the row below that. And so you can see we've gotten really, really good at saying, hey, that those pixels are humans, those pixels are road, those pixels are trees, et cetera. Great, this all seems really excellent. What is the catch? Well, the thing that sort of underlies all this that is perhaps opaque when you first start to get into deep learning is there are huge troves of human workforces that end up labeling that data. So that image I just showed you back there, those pixel level labels are actually really, really time consuming to generate. And so you have to have somebody go through by hand and label each of those pixels. So this is a human labeling farm in China. And what people are doing is they're going through and they are labeling each of those pixels. And doing one of those images right there can take upwards of an hour. And so most of these data sets will have 10, 20, 30,000 images or even more. And so we're talking on order of typically millions of dollars to get that data labeled. And so aside from being expensive, it seems like not the future to me. It seems like we have replaced, I don't know, whatever we were doing before with lots of people in a room labeling things, which doesn't feel like really where we need to end up if we're going to try to automate things, make things easier or better for human beings. Again, so one of these images labeled in this fashion, so this is a human label example, that can take upwards of an hour to do for one. And so particularly working underwater, as I do, there is not the same amount of money and interest in the underwater community to pay people tens of millions of dollars to label lots of images to solve underwater problems as there are with self-driving cars. And so, we really have to think, or at least I hope that we can think creatively about how do we avoid getting into this trap of simply focusing on supervised learning, where we do more and more of this, where we human label things and then develop networks to classify things based on human labels. Not that that is bad. I want to highlight that this work has been, that work has been incredible in opening up lots of commercial and even academic opportunities for people to solve all kinds of new problems. But there is this real divide in my mind between, those giant data sets, so ImageNet being sort of a canonical example of one of those, and this sort of underwater community where, we don't have a canonical ImageNet for the underwater community. But I would also argue that we probably never will, in that the underwater community, and particularly underwater robotics, underwater mapping and perception, is solving so many different problems. And if you talk to any marine scientist or marine archaeologist or anybody who's an application user, they usually have a very different problem they want to solve. It's in a different environment, and the ocean is so much larger and so much more diverse in the way that it looks than terrestrial applications. You end up in a situation where I don't think we're going to end up with an ImageNet for ROVs or for AUVs, but I believe that that is not necessarily a problem if we think about this problem differently. So, okay, cool, robots, but how do we escape this labeling problem? So, my research is focused, my group's research is really focused on three big aspects: self-supervision and unsupervised learning, or cross-modality learning, which is also included in there. So supervising one modality from another. Physics, utilizing physics, which don't change, and so provide a labeling of sorts. And then finally, simulation. I'm only going to really talk about the first two, given kind of time constraints, but if you're interested, my group has some work on simulation and how you can use simulation to avoid hand labeling. Okay, so let's start with physics. So underwater image physics. So this is work done by two former graduate students that have now gone on to great fame and fortune of their own. So Katie Skinner, who's now an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and Ji Lee, who is now a research scientist at the Toyota Research Institute. So this is their work in collaboration with me. So quick lesson on underwater image formation. So if I have a little underwater vehicle there and I have a camera on it and I have a light source, so the camera's in red, the light source is in blue. The physics of this are actually really well understood and it's been studied for many years. So the first thing that you have to deal with is this thing called water column attenuation. And so that means that there is an exponential fall off in the energy that is absorbed by particulates in the water. So as those photons move through that medium, they get absorbed and they get there's less of them when you get to receive them at your camera, right? And so, you send light out, it bounces off things, comes back to your camera, you read that with a CMOS or CCD, and you convert that into a digital image. Benthic reflection, right? So depending on the angle that you hit the source, you get reflections, and so you can make assumptions about how that reflection is going to look. And so we have physics that guide those processes. Water column attenuation when the source comes back, right? So you have to measure the attenuation as it goes to the source and then back from the source. And then finally, there's refraction at the interface, because typically our cameras are in, almost always our cameras are in housing so that they are not exposed directly to the water, which means that there's an interface between the water and the air. And so the water, the glass, and then the air that sits in the inside of that housing. And so we have changes to the field of view of the camera, changes to the effective focal length of the camera, et cetera. All that to say that you don't need to become an expert in underwater image formation. Luckily, other people have done that, but know that there is a physics to that that enables us to know something about how the light is going to be changed by passing through the water column. There's lensing effects, camera response function. And so all of these things combine to produce a digital image. And the physics of these things are always really well conditioned. Okay, so what can we do with that? How do we avoid having to label tons of data and then figure out how that data relates to this sort of underwater image that we formed? Well, one of the challenges, right, we don't have a ton of labels for underwater data, but we do have a ton of terrestrial data, right? So I have tons of data from in air that has something that I'm interested in, which is matched images with depth data. And so there's these things called RGBD sensors. You may be familiar with the Kinect, which was produced for Xbox, but there's tons of them. And what they do is in air, they image things and also give you the range to those images, right? And so what we do is, in this scenario, we want to take some of that data of which there's a great abundance, and we want to use that to supervise a learning process for which we have no labels, which is the underwater data. Okay. So what does that look like? So that means we take our images that we have from the RGBD data, we render a synthetic version of what that would look like underwater with the associated depth information. We then want to take those images and then restore them to the true data that we know, because we have the real data from our underwater or from our terrestrial data set. And then we want to do that same process on the underwater images, but we obviously don't have the matched data for that. So let's step through that. The way this is formulated is a general adversarial network. You may be familiar with these, you may not, but it's pretty simple. You have a generator network that produces fake data. You have a discriminator network that decides whether that data is real or fake by comparing it to some source of real data. And then you iterate on that process in a training regime in which you get better at making fake data and you get better at telling the difference between fake data and real data. Okay, simple enough. So how do we use the physics in this, right? So we have this generator that takes a noise vector and is going to produce this synthetic image from that noise vector. And so what we do is we embed the physics of what we know to be true always for underwater image formation directly into that network. So that means that I know that light is going to attenuate as it comes back to the camera. I know that the image formation model of the camera is going to have these lensing effects. I know that there are going to be fall off in the extremes of the image because of the fact that those rays are being focused up into the image. And I use all those by embedding them into that network directly. What I can do is then produce what I believe to be a photorealistic version of what this in-air image would look like underwater. And then the thing that I learn are those parameters on the physics. So the physics don't change, but the hyperparameters that dictate how much energy is absorbed by the water column, how much fall off is there in the corner of the images, all of those things, those are the things I learned by trying to match those to the data that I am seeing from the underwater vehicle. So again, if we think about just the attenuation model as an example, I have those hyperparameters up there for the essentially distance along the ray and how much effective fall off there is as I move along that ray. So we can do that same thing for backscattering, which is another property of underwater imagery. I can do the same thing for the camera model for any of these. And then ultimately what we want to do is take that and use that to produce a discriminator that is good at telling the difference between fake underwater images and real underwater images, and then a unmapping that takes that underwater image and attempts to map it back to what it would look like in air. Okay, so we can do that with that underwater image restoration network. What we're ultimately trying to do is take that RGBD image, estimate the relative depth of it, and then produce this color restored image that again looks like it was taken in air. So to test this, we set up a test experiment where we had some ground truth data and some synthetic rocks and a camera system, an underwater tank to see if we're actually doing this well. And so the end result is this. You can see the underwater images on the left, which are very typical of what you'd see in an underwater image, right? The water's quite green. Much of the red light has been lost. So, right, attenuation is wavelength dependent. So red light gets absorbed faster than other parts of the spectrum. And then you can see the restored image over there on the right, which again, hopefully looks something more like what you would see as if these rocks were imaged in air. Now, one of the challenges here, right, is that we are trying to restore the relative color balance. Now, we have an absolute color target down there, but you typically don't have that in an underwater deployment. So you don't always know in an underwater deployment what things would look like in the real world. But ultimately for downstream processing, whether that be, object detection or 3D reconstruction or stereo or whatever, the image on the right is going to be much smoother and easier to interpret, we think, for a human being than just sort of what would come straight out of the camera. If there are any questions, I don't know, it's hard for me to see in the human room, but hopefully somebody will just ping us on the chat if anybody wants me to stop at any point and answer any questions. Great. So long story short here is that we get these sort of pretty significant color improvements. The biggest improvement is in the red channel where most of the information is lost. But if you're interested, I would point you to the paper called WaterGAN. The citation can be found from either of my grad students there. So we compare this to a bunch of other techniques that people use in the image restoration field, histogram equalization, gray world, et cetera. And ultimately we think, this produces something that is perhaps more consistent over kind of large depth changes, which ultimately is what we want for AUVs. Okay, so ultimately we can leverage this unsupervised learning to produce these models of underwater image formation. And then as a consequence of that, right, we also get out depth estimation. So we can estimate the depth of the scene dynamically just by looking at these parameters that deal with attenuation and these other things, right? Essentially, the physics encodes the depth of the scene by knowing how much red light has been lost in the images that I'm taking. So it's an under-constrained problem, but you get these rough depth estimates by running these networks forward, and they end up, roughly corresponding to what you see in the real world. Okay, so that is all done monocularly, so you don't actually need stereo cameras for that. But we do a lot of work in my group on stereo camera work, and so in the same way that the physics of the scene enable you to not have to train that data with underwater image labels, there's a self-supervision process inherent to stereo imaging that we use to be able to train a network to be able to recognize the depth of the scene from stereo cameras. Right, so quick stereo lesson, right? Stereo cameras, you have a left camera and a right camera, like you have two eyes. You look at the offset or the shift from the left to the right, and you use that shift as the baseline of a triangle that tells you how far away something is, depending on how far it's shifted, right? So that forms the base of your triangle, and then you know how far you are from that by knowing how far those two cameras are from each other in the stereo pair. So we want to use those physics-based models. We want to use the geometry constraint that's inherent to stereo because we have this one fixed baseline in our stereo rig. And then finally, we want to do some image processing to figure out, how do we turn this into something useful? Okay, so again, this is another paper from those same graduate students where we take stereo imagery and we want to use that to estimate disparity and then to correct the color of that disparity based on the range to objects in that image. And so this geometry constraint gives us this ability to, without labeling, use the fact that we know the geometry of those cameras with respect to each other to be able to supervise the learning process on estimating depth, right? And then in that second part, we have this physics-based model that looks very similar to what I talked about in the last section, and that allows us to correct the color of those resulting images. Okay, right. So in any deep learning approach, you need to express, in any training deep learning, for deep learning, you need to express some loss, right? And so typically in supervised learning, you have some ground truth labels, and those ground truth labels are the things that were hand labeled. But again, in underwater, we don't have that, right? So I don't have anybody saying that this is how far each of these pixels were from one another. And because of that, it means that I don't have the ability to train a network with supervision. So we do the next best thing, which is this self-supervision process. And in this self-supervision process, what we want to do is take the left image and the right image and use the fact that we can project from one into the other, or from the other one into, or vice versa, and use that to supervise the learning process, right? If I have the depth estimation correct, the projection from the left into the right image should line up, or vice versa. And so using that and using the geometry of that, we don't need ground truth labels. We can simply train this network by projecting from one image to the other image. And so, while that seems pretty simple, one of the huge benefits there is that enables us to gather data and use all of that data as our training data, as opposed to some small subset for which we have labels. Okay, so really coarsely, just to go through the details, what we're going to do is we're going to pull out features from the left image and the right image. We're going to run them through a large backbone that extracts all these image features. And then the loss is going to be expressing how closely the warp of the left image to the right image is consistent with the pixels that I'm seeing there. So there's a photometric loss. And then we also enforce a smoothness constraint on top of that to make sure that we end up with a smooth output. Okay, so glossing over some of the details of this, which are in the paper, ultimately what this means is that we can take these stereo rigs, which is the camera in the upper right here, and we can run them over, in this case, a coral reef survey. And using that coral reef survey, we can also get some ground truth data by dropping one of these synthetic rocks and synthetic color targets in that same environment, so that we have some sense that we're doing this correctly. So what you're seeing here is the raw image on the left, the depth map that's estimated from stereo in the center, and then the color corrected version of that on the right. And so you can see, the color in the depth map goes from shallower to deeper, but we're able to reconstruct this coral reef fairly accurately. And again, one of the more important things of this is because we're extracting the depth, we're then able to adjust the color of that, where things that are further away get more red light restored versus things that are closer get less red light restored, right? And so this goes back to that other network we were talking about that's using the physics of underwater image formation to try to estimate the true color, hopefully more accurately. So, with some comparisons to other kind of ground truth sources, right? You can do things like semi-global block matching, which is SGBM, which is some kind of more standard off-the-shelf technique. And you can see that the resulting depth map there that goes from, again, black to white in terms of far to near. There's many more holes in it, but also it struggles to estimate the depth of these underwater scenes pretty accurately. Anyways, long story short, you can have a look at the results in the paper, but we're able to kind of pretty significantly decrease the mean error along with produce a color reconstruction that's more accurate. So some other results here from color correction. And again, we're able to produce sort of more accurate reconstruction of that color bar than we could with sort of more standard computer vision techniques. Cool. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving on to underwater image localization? All right. So thinking about deep learning for other applications, we're also really interested in thinking about how do we localize vehicles underwater, right? So underwater, you have no GPS. And so obviously it's this big challenge to figure out where my vehicle is in the world. So this is work done by a current graduate student of mine, Tian Yi. And so he's been thinking about how do we look at these very different scales. So coarse, really broad scale bathymetric maps, and then fine scale image data that we would gather from a vehicle, flying 2 meters off the bottom, and how do we localize between those two sources? Okay, so This is a pretty classic problem for AUVs. We're flying along and we'd like to figure out where we are in the world by looking at the bottom and saying, well, I know something about what the bottom should look like, and I know what I'm seeing right now. So where am I in the world, right? And this is not something that really happens terrestrially because we have GPS and we know where everything is, but this is something that is been studied pretty heavily for the AUV community. So typically what we want to do is, in an outdoor environment, you'd want to take a query image and figure out where that query image was taken in the world. So if I'm driving around in a car, I want to match that to some aerial imagery like from Google Maps. But for this approach, we're not trying to do the same thing. Imagine that we have a ship that's driving around taking bathymetric measurements of the bottom. And then we are flying around with a kind of low altitude AUV that's taking images of the bottom, and we'd like to figure out where it is likely that those images were taken, given the bathymetry map we have of the full environment. And so we're developing this to fit in as sort of like a plug-in to other localization techniques, whether that be a particle filter or a Kalman filter, or whatever you're doing on your AUV to localize your AUV. You want an additional source, sort of like a bathymetric GPS is one way of thinking about it. Okay, so again, sort of another deep learning-based approach here, right? But we take map patches from a big image or a big source, a big bathymetric source where we know where everything is. And again, in this focus of not having ground truth labeling, what we do know, right, is where we took that sample from. So we can take samples from one location and we can try to match them to samples that are nearby. And we can take samples from very far away in the map and say that these are not close. And we'd like to create a representation or a latent space that separates those two. So this process is known as a contrastive loss. And so we take negative examples, and that's randomly sampling from the map, places that are not where we are currently. And we take positive observations, right, which are observations from where we are right now. And so again, we don't have to label anything explicitly because we know, because we're choosing those samples ourselves, what are positive examples and what are negative examples. And then by producing this contrastive loss, what we're trying to do is separate those in the feature space so that we produce a network and a set of weights that allow us to separate things that are similar and things that are different. And so what this does is this gives us an ability to produce a network that is good at recognizing if the image I'm looking at right now comes from some location on the map, but able to do that without us having to go through and hand label anything, right? And so this contrastive loss process runs, and we jointly train a map encoder and an image encoder. And so what that allows us to do is then to produce a map and a feature vector that tells us how do we then figure out what are the most likely locations in this map from where this image was taken. And so you can think about this as small scale and large scale. And so again, you sample a bunch of pixels from this small scale map. And then you can think about this in this example, like the Google Maps example. Okay, where is this in this large scale Google Map image I have of the world? And so we've done this with data from the Australian Center for Field Robotics. And so we have a 100 meter by 100 meter square area. And the 2D reconstruction has 500 pixels per meter approximately. So then using that, imagine we take a slice through that map, we can then figure out where we believe we are. And so you can see the visualization of essentially a belief map that says, I think I'm here, I think I'm here, I think I'm here in that map from those initial samples. And again, what this enables us to do is then filter this into, let's say, a particle filtering framework is what we're going to do next. But we're saying that, in this example, A, right, the kind of A samples are matched pretty well with the kind of uppercase A region of this map. And the B sample, which is the image lowercase b, is matched with the capital B section of this map. And so what we end up doing is building something that recognizes sandy bottom, rubble, coral substrates, but doing that without having to explicitly train any of these things, by merely saying, let's find things that are similar and let's find things that are different, and then producing a feature visualization or producing a feature map that enables us to localize the vehicle using that data. You can then perform inference using a Dirichlet distribution by saying, okay, what is the observation most likely to have produced this thing I'm seeing now in my belief map Z at some UV location on the map. And so that allows us to actually segment those maps using those features that we've learned without having to do any feature training. Now, what's going on here, right, is that segmentation is going to be unsupervised, right? So there's no human saying this is Sandy, this is X or Y. So that process would have to be done later, right? So all you're going to get out of this is a segmentation map. You're not going to get the semantic labels that tells you that this is coral or this is sandy or this is rocky substrate. But ultimately, what we're really interested in with this approach is being able to then provide that particle filter. So the red is the true trajectory, and then the green are the particles that have survived as probable estimates of where that vehicle could go. And so, again, this sort of visual bathymetry GPS allows us to constrain where we believe we are on the map and to continue to refine that as we move through the space. Okay, switching gears again, we're going to talk a little bit about deep learning for underwater manipulation, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of deployments for that, and then take any questions you might have. This is work done by Gideon. He's he's a final year PhD student about to graduate this year. So anyone out there looking for good postdocs, definitely hit him up. He's really interested in this other problem, which is, for ROVs, we often want to take samples. So this is a push core sample done by an ROV. And so what Gideon's interested in doing is automating the process by which somebody takes one of these samples. So as opposed to this, which was a manually driven process that the ROV pilot, which has to be highly trained and really focused, can't we do this with robots? We do all kinds of other grasping manipulation problems with robots already. So to start, he wanted to figure out how to recognize one of these push core samples underwater. And so he actually started with something even simpler. He said, well, let's just see if we can estimate the 6 degree of freedom pose of objects in RGB perspective images. So, this is anything from pick and place in terrestrial environments to doing this underwater, whatever. But he wanted to start doing this terrestrially before he did underwater. And so he just started with a bunch of random objects, drills, bananas, scissors, etc., with high amounts of clutter. And he's saying, can we learn the pose of those objects with a deep learning network? Okay, so why do this without depth data? Well, underwater, oftentimes depth data is hard to get, and so it can be noisy or sparse. So can we just do this straight up from underwater imagery or from terrestrial imagery? So he produces a feature extraction network, a local embedding, and then a classification and regression network. We won't focus on the details here for time, but you can find the details in his paper. But what ultimately this does is take an input image and then spit out a 6 degree of freedom pose from a perspective input image. And so why he calls this silo net is that the way he ends up doing this is trying to produce a silhouette of those images and then matching those silhouettes to a 3D rotation and translation in the 6 degree of freedom space. And so, long story short, he's able to produce these silhouettes that end up being fairly accurate representations of the pose of those objects. And then from that, on a bunch of terrestrial objects, he's able to show that this works. Great. Okay, how's it relevant for underwater? Well, underwater, oftentimes the problem with manipulation is that we have a very limited viewpoint, right? A 60 degree field of view camera underwater, oftentimes on an ROV, is unable to see unless it's pointed at the workspace or pointed at what it wants to grab. And so he got really interested in fisheye cameras, and can we do the same thing with a fisheye camera? So he took some fisheye camera data from an underwater environment. He put some fiducials in there so that we would have a sense of ground truth. And what he wants to do is figure out, is there some way of doing that exact same 6 degree of freedom estimation of pose, but doing that for underwater data? And so, very little work has been done in this kind of 6 degree of freedom observation, but one of the reasons that's a problem is we need to address these really, really large distortions that exist, right? So you can see there sort of a rectilinear grid, and you can see how distorted a rectilinear grid is in a fisheye lens. So there's lots of ways of addressing this. People do cube mapping. They adapt a kind of local sample to a grid in the local region. You can represent it as a graph. You can represent it spectrally. But what he was really interested in doing is, can we build in that fisheye representation directly into the network, and using that then we directly regress to the 6 degree of freedom poses of these objects. So, he takes the spherical mapping parameters that go from the spherical observations directly onto a reprojection of that with a fisheye model with some estimated parameters that can be calculated offline. And he takes that T handle, which is at the top typically of what we use for push core samples, and he wants to see if we can directly recognize that in images. And so again, in this mapping, ultimately what he wants to do is be able to draw that out directly without having to directly unwarp the fisheye image. So we take a spherical image and we have the fisheye's optical axis that cuts directly through that, and then the fisheye's viewpoint. And what we want to do is estimate the virtual optical axis, right? So we create a virtual image that is going to be the apparent viewpoint of whatever we're looking at, let's say the T handle, within that fisheye lens, right? So the virtual optical axis is the intersection with the sphere of the virtual optical axis and the fisheye's optical axis, right? Okay. And again, we can then calculate a rotation or adjustment to the apparent viewpoint as a rotation between the fisheye's optical axis and this virtual optical axis. And so that regressed apparent orientation allows us to deduce the X, Y, and Z and the rotation of the object we're interested in this fisheye without having to go through this reprojection. So, if we think about the baseline, we take a feature extractor, we run it through some pooling layers, and then we have a translation and orientation. We can do it projectively, where we take that feature, we run it through a projection model, and then we do the same thing. Or we can do it in this perspective image, where we take that fisheye that is warped onto the sphere, we run it through the feature extractor, and then we output a translation and orientation. So this is an example of a set of fisheye images that have T handles in them. And those T handles are in various positions in the scene. We want to fit a 6 degree of freedom pose to them. And then for ground truth, we have those fiducial markers, which are not used in the actual process, but those give us ground truth as to where this is. Okay, so here's an example of that moving around. So this is a fisheye on the end of a manipulator. And you can see over there in the kind of RViz panel that we're not only estimating the position of that, but we are very stably estimating the position of all of those T handles with respect to the position of the arm, which ultimately is what you need to be able to grab and manipulate something in real time. So there is an example of us moving around. That's the virtual T handle projected onto that, and that's a virtual push core projected onto there. And you can see in sort of an augmented reality way that he's estimating both the motion of the camera and the position of those things in real time here. I'll put you the paper for kind of full results, but long story short, you can do almost as well, if not better, with these perspective methods than you can by unwarping any of these things. And then you can see here the silhouettes of those objects, and you can see them changing and warping and deforming as we move around with the T handle, or sorry, with the robotic arm, with the camera mounted on it in an underwater environment here. We're kind of running out of time, so I will just kind of point you to, he's been doing a lot of work now to automate that process. Once you recognize the T handle, can we grasp and manipulate things automatically? So we have this wrist-mounted fisheye camera, and then stereo cameras mounted on the ROV. And he 3D reconstructs the scene and then attempts to manipulate that dynamically. So he's using the fisheye for object detection and visual surveying. And so this has been deployed on the Nereid under ice vehicle. And then, he has to model both where the T handle is, where the cameras are, but then also the doors. And so he's been doing, try to close loop grasp and manipulation. So you can see that is the robot planning, trying to pick up and grab things, and then, place them down elsewhere. And so ultimately the goal here is to create a fully automated system that enables an operator to kind of click and push to where they want the T handle, as opposed to having to actually manually operate and drive everything and execute the plan. So we've got to demonstrate a bunch of cool field deployments. And so this is one with live 3D reconstruction and the robot attempting to manipulate those T handles. And then this is the Nereid vehicle driving around with a live 3D reconstruction and the live real-time position of the arm relative to that. And then this is all, bring it all together to figure out producing a text-to-speech or sort of a real-time saying, I would like to execute this command. And so we interpret the voice commands of that and then actually execute them on the robot. So this is an operator telling the robot what to do as opposed to manually driving it. Okay, Sorry, I ran a little bit long. Thank you for all of your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I'm interested with your color restoration. Some of the things that we've done have shown a problem, obviously, with working underwater is that when you restore colors to the in-air color, in fact, you don't map the color one-to-one. You have an envelope. And so something that looks green underwater, it might be blue, it might be blue-green, it might be whatever. So when you're relying heavily on color to do some of your classification or whatever it is, it's a bit disadvantageous. But of course, the proof is if you're getting it right, it's okay. So my question is really more about the first part is, have you done some sensitivity testing to say that you've mapped an underwater color to, let's say, one single color? What happens to your results if it's not exactly that color? And then sort of a follow-up is, instead of using something like color, using something like texture or structure or something that is not dependent on the color of things. So I'm curious about color restoration, but it's sort of around all those things.
Yeah. No, so it's a great point. One of the challenges is restoring true color is oftentimes impossible, as you're highlighting, because you can't, it's an under constrained problem, and you don't know what the exact water column parameters were. And so even if you did, you're not going to get back to true color. So, in my group, we've moved away from true color as a focus because of the challenges that you're highlighting. What we focus on is color consistency. So I care much less about whether this thing is actually blue or green. I care if I observed it at 1 meter and then I flew back with my AUV on another pass and observed it at 5 meters or 4 meters, that the relative appearance or the relative colors or even the relative kind of grayscale and sort of texture or color changes are consistent. And so we focus much more on that. And so that, to your point, is because it's so hard to actually show true color. But if I don't compensate for the range effects, what you end up seeing is those effects I showed in the very early videos, where you get sort of these zebra stripes, where on one pass of the AUV you were low, and the next pass you were high. And so it appears like light and dark. And we know that's not there, right? We know that it's the same illumination. And to kind of the second point, color actually ends up not being very effective underwater, A, because you lose a lot of color information, right? Because all the red channel's gone. But B, to your point, because we don't have the real colors, and because, water column changes can be so impactful. And so most of the classification work that we focus on actually does focus on texture or sort of color patterns. The nice thing about these unsupervised approaches is that if the color is an inconsistent measure for the outcome we want for producing the loss, inherently the network will begin to disregard it, right? It will throw that away because it is not helpful. It is not a helpful channel or a helpful sort of feature for identifying what we're looking at. And if you look at the large scale image classification problems, take ImageNet or any of the kind of modern segmentation networks, in fact, there's a bunch of really good research that shows you can pass it all black and white images, or sorry, grayscale images, and it still does pretty well. Now it gets some things wrong. It's worse at, telling the difference between, horses and zebras, right? But that's not a great example, but things that really are dependent on color, but it ends up being very few in like the kind of terrestrial context of like the ImageNet world. So no, I totally agree that I think that texture and patterns are much more important underwater. And illumination consistency, I think, is much more important than true color in this context.
So your classification for real or fake images based solely on discriminator output. So, for example, to know if an image is real looking, you know it's real looking, but you don't necessarily know if there's a correspondence between your input fake image that you changed and pass it through the discriminator, or generated the new underwater image and pass it to the discriminator. I guess my question is, how do you, even though the output image is realistic, how do you enforce that it corresponds to the input synthetic image?
Yeah, so the constraint is based on the physics. So we say that if we take an image and we make it appear underwater based on these ranges and these parameters, right? So we say that these are the hyperparameters of attenuation in the different channels, and this is the image formation model. What we can then do, right, is look at real data and say, is this real data consistent with the synthetic data that we're producing with the same depth information? So with the stereo information we have, right, from left, right, we have range. And so then the idea is, as that network gets trained, it has to produce fake data that matches the physics. Now, to your point, it's possible that you can under-constrain the problem, so you can produce fake data that matches the physics and somehow isn't correctly aligned to the real data. But we think that the key here is that because you're constraining the parameters that you can change to be these physical parameters, you end up not having the problem that you typically have with GANs, which is that you can produce data that is photorealistic, but may not have any bearing on reality, right? So you can produce things that look like faces, and that works really well for kind of synthetic environments. But here, if you think about the space of the parameters that you're changing, because I'm only changing these things that are attenuation based or image formation based, you end up physically constraining the problem so that the output you get out, you can see if it makes sense, right? Because ultimately what you're getting out is, okay, these are the attenuation coefficients for the water that I'm in. These are the image formation model that says how much darkening happens to the sides. And you can look at those and say, okay, do these physically make sense? And that's sort of the check that we have to make sure that we're not producing garbage.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about, have you had any significant issues with turbidity, especially when you're at depth and are trying to do those automation techniques? How do you adapt to that, especially if you have a super silty or heavy bottom?
Yeah, I didn't show this, but Gideon's done a fair bit of work. I mean, it's quite bad when the ROV hits the bottom because it just kicks up a ton of sediment. And so most of the work you're seeing there is done 5 minutes after the ROV has touched down, or often the ROV will be hovering, which makes the problem harder. And so in fact, I mean, if you can't see anything, you can't see anything. You can do some work where you move the light sources, and that helps a fair bit. There's some kind of research ongoing about using light fields to help think about how to address turbidity and kind of reduce the impact of it. But ultimately, practically with those ROVs, what we try to focus on is kicking up as little sediment as possible, or waiting until that sediment is away. ROV pilots are actually quite good at that. I mean, they have the exact same problem, right? Like an ROV pilot knows that if they kick up a bunch of sediment, they're not going to see anything, and then they're not going to be able to do anything. And so they get actually pretty good at figuring out exactly where they can hover in the water column, or exactly where they can set down, and what they can do then. And ultimately, I think that the robotic techniques here are going to be helpful, because probably the right answer is you do want to hover, and you want to hover far enough away or at some angle so that you're not kicking up sediment. In which case, it's much harder for a human being to constantly compensate for the fact that you are moving around. And I think that the automated techniques, when they get there, are going to be really good at addressing that problem.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay, so is there anything? Okay, so with that, we're gonna finish. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.